As always, I don't read reviews until after I've written about a game I'm interested in. And as I played through the new Dragon Age game, I had a feeling it was going to be deeply divisive. In many ways, Veilguard is a massive change that amounts to something like a complete Dragon Age reboot, but it's also easy to forget that every Dragon Age game has been something of a soft reboot, with each one having a completely different combat system, a different scope, and a different story focus. Now, the one constant across the first 3 games was the tone of the world and the themes. The first Dragon Age starts out grim and gets grimmer as the game moves along. The second game is possibly even more grim, and while the third one perhaps has less in the way of difficult moral choices, Veilguard strays far from the roots of the series by having almost none. Now, how important those roots were to you will probably go a long way towards deciding your reaction to this game. This is a ridiculously long game, and as always, I'm not interested in doing a 3-hour video essay where I just rehash the entire experience so you don't have to play it. Instead, I'll do my usual thing and talk about the few most interesting things about the game and either read the angry comments disagreeing or help you make a choice on whether to pay $70 for this thing. Today, we'll talk about the new combat and progression in Dragon Age, the change in tone and narrative RPG elements, the quality of the writing, the idea that Veilguard is too woke, and finally, whether the game's too long for its own good. If you like what I have to say, or at least how I sound saying it, do us both a favor and like, share, comment, yada yada yada. Okay, Veilguard, after the logo. Combat. It's never been good. Until now. There have only been a few constants in Dragon Age as a series. The grim dark world, the moral choices, and the shockingly terrible combat. Every single one of these things is now no longer a constant with Veilguard. Now, 2 of those things are probably worse for the changes, but one of them is absolutely better, and that's the combat. I've only played each of the Dragon Age games once, and I think there's a reason for that. I simply cannot bring myself to slog through the combat of those games more than once. Origins had terrible combat and enemy variety. It was a classic CRPG system, but bad and shallow. Dragon Age 2 has even worse combat, even shallower than the first, and with even less enemy variety. And that's compounded by there being a truly ridiculous amount of it. You can't walk 10 feet in Dragon Age 2 without 50 guards spawning. It's horrific. Inquisition kind of tried to split the difference. You get the choice of top-down or real-time action, and the enemy variety is definitely better, but the action system feels like a tab-targeting MMO, and the top-down feels like it's tacked on to insulate the developers from criticism. It's boring and bad. Isometric CRPG combat is like 30 years old now. You can't get away with basic tab-targeting cooldown management or boring real-time with pause. The best games in the genre now all do something interesting. Larian uses complexity and environmental interactions to keep things interesting. Many other studios have gone to XCOM-style turn-based tactical. A new Dragon Age game wasn't going to be able to trot out a 1996 combat system but make pretty animations and get away with it. Faced with this reality, BioWare went completely back to the drawing board and created an action combat system, and in my opinion, it's quite excellent. It's the first Dragon Age game that I can see myself actually playing again. The comp here is obvious. Veilguard plays an awful lot like the new God of War games, except with a pulled-back camera and, more important, companion integration. I started the game on the default difficulty and found it too easy, but the next level up from that, which I think is called Underdog, felt about right for a first-time playthrough. It was hard enough that I died 5 or 6 times and managed to be pushed in most fights, but was never frustrated with anything. Most importantly, I think the combat's definitely solid enough mechanically that a future playthrough on the hardest difficulty would be interesting. Veilguard does a great job balancing magic and melee. I played the warrior class and found it extremely engaging the entire way through. As you level up, you end up having to seamlessly switch between throwing your shield, 2 different melee weapons, parrying, and spells. I never had that Dragon Age 2 moment where I thought to myself, oh my god, why do I have to fight these enemies, man? BioWare has been running its combo explosion thing forever now. Both Mass Effect 2 and Dragon Age 2 started having explosive combos as a core of the combat, and that's run straight through every game since, with it being the best part of every game's combat. Even Anthem and Andromeda, for all of their flaws, both got this part very right. In Veilguard, you end up building out your party based upon combo primers and finishers, just like the other games. On the harder difficulty level, this starts to become pretty important as enemies are extremely tanky, and combos act as both AoE explosions and a time slow. Also, just like Anthem, they got the sound of this just right, man. It just feels, sounds, and looks great. I didn't play any other class because this game is insanely long, so I just finished it, but watching a few videos, it seems that the combat remains balanced even with the ranged magic classes. The warrior, though, really does feel like God of War, with parrying being a hugely important mechanic and a shield throw instead of an axe throw. BioWare has basically finally totally figured out the Frostbite engine, and everything pretty much sings in the combat. Animations are fantastic, sound design is perfect. It is very satisfying to parry enemies, and setting them up with a companion spell and building your rage up to finish the combo doesn't get old, even after 80 hours. It's top-notch shit. The beauty of that combo system is it means companions still really matter. These aren't just banter machines walking next to you. The diverse set of skills the companions have really matters to party composition, and using their healing abilities and combo abilities really is a pretty difficult layer of complexity to manage during hectic fights. The game doesn't have a huge amount of enemy variety, a lot like the first God of War reboot in that way. But I can forgive that because the combat here is really polished, and the enemies that are here all fit into very important archetypes. Also, like the first God of War game, it's very disappointing that there's a serious lack of boss variety. My biggest problem with that first God of War reboot was that you fought 4 unique bosses, and the troll things were reused so often. Veilguard does the exact same thing with dragons in place of trolls, and hectic mob wave fights for most of the biggest bosses. It's a real shame, but because the bosses themselves are all quite well done, I have no doubt that the studio is capable of making a diverse set of good bosses for the next game. It takes a ton of time and effort and iteration to completely reinvent a series' combat. To change the entire genre and build it back from the ground up probably took years. Hopefully the next Dragon Age game takes a page from Ragnarok, and now that they have their combat system nailed down, they can expand enemy variety and make sure that at least big story bosses are memorable encounters instead of glorified wave fights. Progression. When it comes to progression, I'm positive many are going to be disappointed that stats are gone. I also find it annoying that stats are disappearing from big budget RPGs. I think Bethesda has made a tremendous mistake taking stats out. I think it's very disappointing that Avowed also doesn't seem to have stats. I think stat allocation is a core part of what makes an RPG progression system engaging, but I'm also humble enough to assume the professionals making these games have a bunch of data that shows them that people like skill trees and gear progression more than stats. Veilguard's progression is entirely skill trees and gear. Luckily, they're very large, diverse, and impactful skill trees. They require real trade-offs, and most nodes are significant changes to the character. I don't think any of them are minuscule stat upgrades. You're not choosing between plus 1% melee damage or plus 1% mana generation. Each class has 4 possible specializations, all of which are quite distinct. You'll end up with enough points to max out one branch, while picking a few important things from other trees. It feels like you have exactly enough skill points to have to make hard choices without feeling like you're being unfairly nerfed. Respec is free, but just annoying enough to not be something you'll do on a whim. You have to refund one skill at a time, so if you want to totally respec, you're going to be in there a while. And you know what? I think that's a pretty good way to balance it. Gear and gear upgrades are well balanced and highly impactful. What stuff you use really does massively change how you're going to approach combat, what companions you'll use, and which spells and abilities you'll slot. Finding gear was always exciting. It's well paced out, and there's enough to offer a good amount of variety, but not so much that you're spending a ton of time managing pointless inventory clutter. It feels just about perfectly designed and balanced. And you know what? That's the kind of polish that can make a game feel clunky and annoying if it's wrong, but turn invisible if it's right. I had pretty high hopes that Veilguard would at least have competent combat. The last 2 BioWare games were very disappointing, but Andromeda really was a massive step forward for the studio. And Anthem is a legit action game. The dream is combining the mid-2000s BioWare RPG with the combat of the last 2 games. Veilguard is a step towards that dream. We'll get to the story and RPG stuff next, but the combat is not only clearly the best the studio has ever done, it's legitimately one of the better action games you'll play. Even at times when I was annoyed at some of Veilguard's issues, the combat meant I was always having a good time. Writing a narrative. When it comes to writing a narrative, things are far more mixed. Veilguard takes place very far from the previous games, and as such, it leaves a bunch of the most interesting world-building elements behind, and I think that's for the worse. The Templar versus Mages conflict is one of the elements that made Dragon Age feel so interesting and morally nuanced, and for all the faults of the previous games, they did all present the player with a lot of interesting ethical choices. Just because the game moved to an action combat system doesn't mean they needed to move away from one of the best parts of the previous games. But I'm sad to report that Veilguard has shockingly few choices to make, and the ones that you do get to make almost feel like they've been thrown in as an afterthought, or as they're left over from a previous iteration of the game. The first mission has you deciding the fate of a corrupt mayor. You can kill him or send him to the Wardens, and that sounds kinda like something that would have been in the first 3 games. But this choice is actually pretty much meaningless. You know nothing about this guy. You hear about him about 2 minutes before you find him, and sending him to the Wardens just means you'll see him later in the Warden levels. It doesn't affect anything about the world. The tone of the game isn't happy-go-lucky by any means. A ton of bad stuff is happening, and you see a bunch of corpses and blood as you play through the levels, but there's basically no politics in this game at all. There are no faction choices to make, really at all. You don't decide any leaders. You don't change events in any way at all beyond killing things. Now, killing things is very fun, but for all intents and purposes, Veilguard is a narrative action game with a dialogue system, but it's not an RPG. And the choices you do make have been very badly handled. The game constantly tells you what the consequences of your dialogue choices are. When you're pursuing a romance with a character, the game labels your choices so you'll know which choices will or will not lead to the romance. Every time there's a choice to be made in dialogue, the game makes absolutely sure you know exactly which choice to pick to get the outcome you want. Now, I generally don't complain about hand-holding in games. I like maps and waypoints because I don't want to waste a bunch of fucking time wandering a map looking for a pixel to click on to complete a quest. Nothing pisses me off more than a search the area quest step that expects me to bumble around and click on things. Just put a waypoint on the thing you want me to click and stop wasting my time. That's good hand-holding as far as I'm concerned. But that doesn't mean I want narrative hand-holding. Just like I don't want to play Sekiro in God mode, I don't want to play an RPG with all of my dialogue options precisely labeled so I get the exact outcome I want every time. This actually blows my mind that someone thought this was a good idea. It's like abysmal. If there was some setting to turn this off, it annoys the hell out of me that this was the default and it wasn't made very clear that I was playing on narrative easy mode for some reason. And if this is just how the dialogue was designed, incomprehensible that any player would want this. What the hell is the point of a dialogue system if this is how it's going to work? Veilguard is already barely an RPG, and this mechanic takes what little stakes there are in the dialogue and just basically eliminates it. Once you see this, it means you can be pretty certain that no other dialogue choice actually matters. Because if an important choice was being made, obviously the game would be making sure I knew exactly what I was choosing as it has the rest of the time. I can't stress enough just how terrible this is. It's this system that actually made me realize I wasn't playing an RPG, but rather a narrative action game with dialogue and a couple of choices thrown in. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a good narrative action game with dialogue. I actually think it's really good. But that's mainly because Solus is a great character that we're all invested in, and the companions are all really, really great. The game is basically Mass Effect 2 without any of the interesting ethical stuff that's in that game. It's like Mass Effect without the genophage. Still, the writing in general is good. Now, the whole reason to look forward to this game was the final DLC of Inquisition. And yet, early in Veilguard, I started feeling like I was playing a bait and switch. I was sold the idea of a game about stopping Solus, and ended up with a game about fighting two of Solus's enemies and stopping the Blight. But as the game goes on, Solus and his history and motivation are really done justice, and he's a major part of everything that happens. And you do have a choice of how to handle Solus at the end of the game, which ends up feeling pretty satisfying. All of the companions and their quests feature great dialogue and interesting characters, and almost all of the cutscenes are top-notch. Voice acting is stellar from start to end, and you do come to like all of your party members. Still, even though the writing is of a super high quality all the way through, it still just feels really disappointing that there's so few actual political or ethical choices to make. I mean, that's kind of been the core to Dragon Age games, and to have it totally gone is jarring. If this was a new game called Minotaur Time: The Dark Guard, I'd have absolutely no complaints about the narrative or writing. But this is Dragon Age 4, and as such, I think it's fair to be a little miffed that they forgot that the core of a great RPG is making choices that have real consequences. And I'll tell you what, there are plenty of places they could have done it too. The leader of the Qunari in this game is barely in it, but he's super interesting. You could have easily focused on the Butcher and had a choice of how to handle him. You could have made the Crows and the Governor and their Butcher a real political choice. You could have decided how the Wardens were led and what they ended up being. You could have had a choice of how Minrathous was governed between the Magisters and the street gangs. Everything is there to have a classic narrative RPG experience, a classic Dragon Age experience. The characters are interesting, the writing is great, every zone has an interesting conflict happening. But they, I guess, just decided not to, and I find that baffling. Also, I have to say this, Veilguard awkwardly interacts with the previous games. It's odd to be an entirely different part of Thedas, place that has nothing to do with the politics and history of the games that we know. It's odd to see so many people from Inquisition, and the game doesn't really account for it in any way. Apparently, you could have edited the game to make it conform to your Inquisition playthrough, but somehow I missed that option. So, my story revolved around my Inquisitor, who was an elf woman who had romanced Solus, when in fact, I was a male human who kind of thought Solus was a douche. This made it more than a little weird that my Veilguard game ended with my gender-swapped Inquisitor choosing to spend the rest of their life with Solus in the Veil, when actually my Inquisitor never in a million years would have done that. I mean, I like Solus okay, and I felt bad for his situation and I wanted to help him out, but I definitely didn't like him enough to spend eternity with him in Magic Land. When all's said and done, Veilguard feels like it's a total narrative reset as well as a mechanical reset. It's completely different. You end the Blight. The Wardens are pretty much totally wiped out. You defeat the old gods. You end up sending Solus back to the Fade. And while I do honestly think it's a great ride, narratively, a ton of that is just super duper top tier production values and good character writing. The companions are great, but playing a Dragon Age game where you make no decisions is going to make some people very unhappy, I think. Now, I enjoyed it for what it was, but I've enjoyed it a hell of a lot more if it had the same tone and choices of the earlier games mixed with the much better level design and combat of this game. Oh yeah, the level design was really great here. The last two games were awful, man. 2 had some of the most boring garbage levels I've ever played in a supposedly AAA game. And Inquisition was a pointless open world that felt like a discount Ubisoft game filled with a bunch of stupid filler activities. Veilguard got level design absolutely perfect this time. It's just a shame that it doesn't really feel like a Dragon Age game story. Did Dragon Age go woke? No. Every BioWare game has always been woke, so anyone complaining about this is either an idiot or hasn't played any of the previous BioWare games. But you know what? I'll humor this argument because I actually think there's some interesting things to say about the Tosh storyline and how it's handled. Every single time there's one of these little woke controversies in gaming, I admit I get very irritated. In the same way, I get irritated in the other direction. During the height of the Great Awakening, there was a backlash to Kingdom Come Deliverance because all of the NPCs were white. Of course, there were a bunch of humans in that game, but I guess Turkic people don't count as non-white? I don't know. It's difficult to understand. But my response to complaining about that is the same as my response to complaining about a trans character. If you want a game, or a story, or a film like that, go and make a game or story or film like that. I've got basically zero tolerance for this shit because it's infuriating and stupid. If the writers at BioWare really wanted to tell a story about a party of 6 non-binary polyamorous minotaurs who defeat the patriarchy, that's fine with me, man. I'll play it and judge it on how convincing I find the polyamorous minotaurs. If a developer wants to make a game about 15th century Bohemia and they have nothing but Bohemians and Cumans, I'll play that and judge it by how immersive the game is. And if you want a game with all white people, or all straight people, or all black people, or all BIPOC people, that's great, go make that game. Otherwise, give me a break. Transgenderism has existed everywhere forever. It's a perfectly interesting thing to address in a game. Now, all that being said, I don't think it's done particularly well in Veilguard. Not because it's woke, but because it's so fast it feels pretty rushed and out of left field. It feels really rushed to have Tosh open up about this. Tosh's mother also comes to grips with this whole thing way too quickly, and so the payoff isn't earned in any way. Seeking acceptance from a parent is a universal experience, so the storyline is easy to connect to. But this should be a multi-step process and not one quick cutscene before it's resolved 2 seconds before Tosh's mom gets murked. Now, I admit, I found myself wincing when Tosh suddenly announces that she learned the word non-binary in Minrathous, and that's what she is. First of all, why wouldn't we have found this word together on a quest? This is the core of Tosh's storyline, so why is it just kind of hand-waved that she ran off to Minrathous on her own and what? Went around asking random people what the word is for someone who doesn't feel like their birth gender? It's ham-fisted and cheap. Secondly, it feels a little weak to use the word non-binary. Shouldn't it have been some like elven word, or some unique term used in Thedas, or I don't know. It's quite jarring to have non-binary used as it immediately rips me into our world when a Kunari word would have worked just as well, allowed for an actual quest to discover that word, and would have more seamlessly fit within the game world. So, this is a classic pointless gaming controversy. Who gives a shit if there's a non-binary character in the game? If you don't like it, you're free to go make your own stories that don't feature non-binary characters. But more importantly, the stupidity of the controversy overshadows actually dealing with the fact that the storyline is handled badly because it tries to have it both ways. It wants an important story dealing with a real-world issue, but doesn't trust the writers or the player to actually learn anything. In an RPG, the player should be free to reject Tosh's new identity, and then have real consequences for that action. The player should be allowed to discourage Tosh and have her leave the party, and the entire storyline can't be delivered in a cutscene. It needs to be an actual mission out in the levels. As it stands now, it's something it feels like the player isn't even involved in, and it's wrapped up quickly in a way that doesn't feel earned. The problem with Dragon Age isn't that it's too woke. Every fucking BioWare game is woke. And if you don't like it, you're free to go make your own games or restrict yourself only to games that aren't woke. The real problem is the writing doesn't do a potentially very interesting RPG quest justice. It's not woke, it's just mid. And that's ultimately much worse. Wrapping up. So what are we left with here? Well, we're left with the best level design and combat ever in a BioWare game, and that's a fact. Veilguard has the best levels ever in a BioWare game, and the best combat ever in a BioWare game. We're left with a game that shows that BioWare has now fully mastered the Frostbite engine and made one of the most beautiful games ever. Seriously, this thing is fantastic looking. Art design is impeccable. Levels and textures are gorgeous. It's full of amazing set pieces. Hell, you end this game fighting around Soulless, transformed into a huge wolf, fighting a dragon. It's incredible. And the game runs perfectly. I played it at 4K on Ultra, and it ran great. We've got a gear system that's pretty excellent, and again, probably the best ever in a BioWare game. We've got impeccable sound and music, exquisite production values, and voice acting that's as good as any game you'll play, with the exception of the player character, who's kind of a non-entity. That's the unambiguously great stuff. It's a large and important list. That list means that Veilguard is at very least a really good game. But there are issues. Having no stats is an annoyance that I will never get used to in an RPG. The lack of any real choices leaves you feeling a bit ripped off, and the total lack of politics, ethical dilemmas, and the dark world building of the earlier games means it often doesn't actually feel like a true Dragon Age game. The story, while very good, also feels like a huge reset, for no real reason. They needed to reset the gameplay, but not the story and tone. As I got past 80 hours of this thing, I found myself thinking it felt strangely rushed. This mammoth behemoth of a game probably should have been split into at least 2, maybe 3. The foundation for a new Dragon Age trilogy was all here. This game could have been about defeating Gillenane, the second one should have been about defeating Elrenon, and the final game dealing with Soulless and his plans. Instead, while all the story stuff is great, it feels like too much is dealt with too quickly. And because we're dealing with all of this stuff, we never actually get to stop and engage in the politics and ethics of the world. Also, it's insane to give people 80 hours for $70 at this point. It just seems like a terrible business decision as far as I'm concerned. So, after all that, I really enjoyed Veilguard. It was an easy 8 out of 10 for me, which ironically is about what I thought of the other 2 games. Maybe Dragon Age 2 was a 7 because the gameplay and level design were so bad. But I can't help feeling that this game could have been a 10. They've got the foundation locked in now. The combat system is great. Give me stats, improve enemy variety, and give me 5 more unique bosses, and they've nailed it. Production, setting, and acting is great. Writing is very good. But use that writing to give me real choices and the same ethical decisions about the politics of the world, and we're all the way there. Veilguard is best looked at as a soft reboot. It's BioWare's God of War. Now they just need to add a bit more BioWare RPG, and they're fully back on track. Either way, for all the important complaints I had about Veilguard, it has left me far more confident in the new Mass Effect game than I was before playing this. They've got everything they need, except they just need to remember that in RPGs, you have to trust the player to make mistakes. And an RPG with no real choices or consequences really isn't an RPG at all. Alright, I don't know what's next. I played a bunch of stuff lately, and we've got Stalker coming out next week. I don't know. Thanks for coming. I'll see you next time. Bye.